Okay, we should be live on Facebook. My name is Leora Levy. I am working for ASI, and we are having our 5th webinar this Monday. And I hope lots of people are joining us today because we're going to dig deep with Somms and other experts. We are going to talk about terroir. And the subject of terroir is truly at the heart of the sommelier role. In order to link the dirt in the vineyard to the liquid in the glass for ourselves and our guests, we need to both understand and establish a sense of place. Terroir is what separates one wine from another, and retelling the story of provenance to our guests is a part of the way we communicate and what separates one wine from another. But exactly how that communication happens and what the interpretation is a very individual question. So we started digging and asked a few people to join us along the way. And today we're honored to have an incredible panel of experts joining us from all corners of the globe. First up is Curly Haslam-Coates from Tasmania. Hi, Curly.
Hi.
Hi. Curly is a wine educator and writer with 25 years in the industry. And then we have Rastislav Sutak, who is a sommelier and educator from Slovakia. Hi. Hi. And he's a longtime vocal defender of terroir-driven wines. We have Matthew Landry, he's a certified sommelier and current French programs director of the Wine Schooler Guild based in Vancouver, Canada. Hi, Matt.
Hello.
And finally, we have Tim Atkin, British Master of Wine, journalist, critic, and commentator. Hi, Tim.
Hello.
And then, of course, we always have our partners with us. And this month, our partners include Jean-Pierre Durand. Hi, Jean-Pierre.
Hi, everybody.
And he has a very long line of description of what he does, because he is not only the director of strategic marketing and communications department, but also the sustainable development division. And he is also the president of Advini Southwest and the Bordeaux regions from France, obviously from the Advini group. And then from Argentina, we have Marcelo Belmonte with us, head agronomist from Trapiche. Hi, Marcelo, welcome.
Hi everybody.
So we have a very exciting panel today, and we've decided to change our format a little bit this month. We've been doing different way of questioning our panelists each month. And this time we've been throwing out open-ended questions to the group, and hopefully there will be some debate among the panelists this time, because all these people, they bring very different experiences and interpretation to what terroir really is. And while there are no right answers, I think that a healthy exchange is the verbal equivalent of biodiversity. So guys, let's talk about terroir. Because with all of us coming from so many different places, cultures, and experiences, it seems like a good idea to help us understand where the other is coming from. So how do you define terroir, and has that definition changed over time as you deepen your understanding for a wine? Rastislav, what's your take on terroir?
Also, maybe I'm old school, or I'm a little bit traditional, but to me, the terroir is really sense of the place. I worked 20 years in hospitality and gastronomy, and wines which have something like originality, uniqueness, and character was still somewhere in my DNA. And sense of the place where the grape wine brewing, where the sun is shining on the vineyard, somewhere is the river or the lake, and somewhere is it more cloudy or foggy. And this was something what impressed me, like definition of terroir, like definition of something that is unmistakable. And maybe mysterious somewhere.
Yeah, I can relate to that. What about you, Matt? What's your take on terroir? Good morning. It's very early in Canada. I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's 6 a.m. That's coffee, I promise. Yeah, I mean, I think the definition of terroir, if you just looked it up on in the dictionary, I think it's an explanation for the natural environment for something that where something comes from. It makes sense to me. I think it's important, and maybe how my definition has changed over time, is that I don't conflate terroir with typicity. I think that typicity is a much larger conversation that includes terroir. And, so much of what we think of when we think of wine, American oak and Rioja, or, surly aging and muscadet, those are not natural phenomena. Those are man-made, those are cultural, historical. And I think that's an appropriate distinction to make, because I think when we talk about, there was talking about terroir, and then there's talking about terroir-driven wines, or wine having terroir. And I think that gets very confusing because people conflate those two issues. So I think it's important to keep them somewhat separate.
Exactly. Yeah, I think you're totally right about that. It is, and it is confusing for a lot of people. Tim, do you have a concise take on terroir?
Yes, I'll be very brief. I mean, I think some of the things that need to be said have already been said. I like this term that I think Matt Kramer came up with, which was somewhereness, which is, a sense of place. But for me, I slightly disagree with Matt, our Matt, in that I think that somewhereness includes the people. I mean, not just the people who live there now, but the people who have formed the landscape over centuries. If you look at Burgundy, the walls were built by human beings. Where the best vineyards in Burgundy were cited was actually chosen by the monks, a long time ago. That's one thing I'd say. The other thing I'd say is that everywhere has terroir. I mean, there's a famous Gertrude Stein quote. She said, "There's no there." I don't know what she was describing, some place she'd been born or something. And I think that terroir is the opposite. There's a there. Everywhere has terroir, but there are good terroirs and there are bad terroirs. And there are people who express terroir well, and there are people who really stuff it up. So that would be my brief take on terroir.
Well, I like that. It's good that we don't completely agree with each other. Otherwise, it would be
almost agree.
Exactly. No, but that's good. Otherwise, it would be very boring if everyone's like, yeah, I agree with you. Yeah, that's no more to be said. Curly, do you have a take on terroir that's different or similar, but slightly different?
Well, I think it's definitely quite a mix. I've found myself more and more saying that the two most important words are "it depends." And so I really agree with that somewhereness of the idea of a sense of place, definitely about the people. That's something that, has been a relatively new development for me, understanding very much that human and cultural influence as well. So yeah, it's incredibly complex, I think, what anybody means of terroir, but at the same time, it does give us an opportunity to think of, at least as a start or a somewhere or a thing, or if there's something that we can shackle to sort of help with our understanding. And there is definitely something about being in a place and having that moment of going, okay, makes sense now, right, okay. Just by being somewhere and looking around, it's like, oh, right, okay, something that previously is baffled makes sense. And so I think that's, that's an important thing as well.
I agree. What about our head agronomist? What do you think, Marcelo? Obviously, you're deep into the dirt and you're with your hands getting all dirty all day long.
Yes, of course, that probably my experience is more related with viticulture because it's my background, of course, and always trying to relate, the sensory attribute of the wine with the site, with the environmental situation in which that grapes has been grown, and then the quality of the wines that come from that place, and always very concentrated with the team trying to understand climatic variation, soil variation, and usually is the best places, not the perfect places, the best places for me are those places with some kind of environmental stress because of the soil or the climate, but terroir is more than environmental studies. I agree that it has to be a lot with the man, with the influence of the human being in the area that shaped the landscape. And now I'm looking back to the past, looking what the immigrant has been doing or has done in Argentina, and they were right in many things. So it's not just a study or scientific approach, it's looking what has been done by the immigrants and learn from them as well.
Yeah, I agree. And like you said, in Argentina, you have a lot of influence from immigrants who built the wine industry back in the day. And in France, Jean-Pierre, Advini has terroir-driven estates all over France and even in South Africa.
Yes, we have. And just for me, as a reaction to all of you, 25 years ago, when I started to go around the world to showcase my wines, I realized that nobody could translate the word terroir. And still today, everybody is using terroir. So it means it was a concept. And this concept at the beginning, I thought it was a good way to sell more wines coming from the same area. But then I spent 15 years in Burgundy, and by my friends winemakers, I could discover precisely that, and I'm very agree with Tim, terroir is, of course, what the dictionary describes, but most of all is how the humans are translating it into emotion in a glass, to have someone far away from the plot to understand that specific quality of this approach. And the second thing is, I thought the concept was kind of frozen, but by the end, I realized that that's a lot to do. So I think we're going to talk about it later.
And I think it's really nice that, I mean, all of you obviously have a long experience in the wine trade, whether it be in restaurant or as importers, exporters of wine, or agronomists. We've had a recent interview with Brian McClintock, American sommelier, and he suggested that how we interpret terroir is a less interesting question than how terroir interprets us, how the geographical landscape shapes culture and contributes to its identity. We all come from very different landscapes, culture, and identities. What do you think? And can you talk about a terroir that has perhaps somehow shaped you in a way? I guess, Jean-Pierre, you just said that you've been with Burgundy for a long time. Maybe that is a terroir that shaped you a bit.
Totally, because I'm originate from Châteauneuf-du-Pape. And when I left my region, it was just about types, the 13 types of Châteauneuf-du-Pape. And then being confronted to all the climat in Burgundy and all the different little parcels that will be definitely giving different wines. When I went back to Châteauneuf-du-Pape, the first thing I did in Châteauneuf-du-Pape was to look down on my feet to soil and subsoil, and to start understanding better what is happening down there, to make sure we can express different styles. And today, I think Tim tried it. The collection of terroir from Augier is good expression of that. I'll talk about it later.
Okay, yeah. Tim, do you have something to comment on that?
No, I mean, I agree with what you said about the expression of terroir. I mean, anywhere that's moved me, I think it's a landscape and it's a history and it's a culture. It's not just the geology. And I think sometimes we're, as wine writers, certainly, I don't know about as sommeliers, I'm not a sommelier, but you tell me, we we reduce the whole thing and we say limestone wine tastes like this, granite-based wines taste like this, schist wines taste like this, clay is that. And we'll get into this later, maybe about flavors and structures of wines and whether they reflect geology. And I know it's controversial, but I think to me, it's a landscape, as you said, that moves me. You know, that Châteauneuf-du-Pape. I lived in Avignon for a year, so Châteauneuf-du-Pape moves me in a way that maybe I don't know, Cahors doesn't, because I haven't lived in Cahors. So I think that emotional connection you have with a place. Sometimes it's logical, but other times, I mean, the Andes, particularly for me, is probably my favorite place on earth. And there's something that I can't define there. It's almost as if I'm not a Buddhist, but if you believe in, you know, that you have various lives, that you sort of think, was I here at some point in the past? And maybe it's a very strong emotional connection. It's not remotely scientific. And I think part of terroir isn't scientific, and it's the mystery of terroir, which some people think is just sort of nonsense and not very precise. And if you're a scientist, that may be true. But I think, to me, it's part of it. It's the emotional dimension of terroir that is very important to all of us, I think, and to consumers. Yeah.
I agree. And what's very interesting, for those of you who don't know Tim, I guess most of you do, but Tim is, I would say, an expert on Argentinian wine. You've been to Argentina, I don't know how many times, and then you're famous for writing about Argentina. So I guess you and Marcelo, you have a lot in common. I guess you know each other also, probably.
We do. Yeah.
But
also, I feel the Andes on the other side too. I should say.
In Chile as well, yeah.
It's, you know, I feel it in Chile too. Sorry, Marcelo.
No, that's fine. That's great. No, I think that Tim knows more than Argentina than we do, because he has the chance to, you know, to taste many wines here. But I agree that it's not just about knowledge terroir, because it's impossible to study terroir. There are so many factors playing that it's impossible to study terroir. So it's something that is, of course, emotional. And for me, you know, planting vineyard and managing vineyard throughout Argentina, for me is a great experience that, you know, helped me to understand better the impact of terroir, or to understand better the concept of terroir. And of course, we don't have the history that Europe has, but we have the chance to learn from Europe, of course, and trying to study their approach and apply those approach here in Argentina. But of course, that we have a lot of to learn from immigrants again. The latest vineyard that I developed was, you know, trying to look back to the past, to plant this small vine, high density Malbec, unrooted vines in some places, you know, because I realized that they were right, you know.
But it is very interesting. And I don't know, Curly, do you have a special connection to any specific terroir?
Yeah, you know, when Tim was talking about the Andes, just it's not sensible or tangible, but it's such a special place. And you know, I haven't yet had the chance to go to Argentina, but I've been to Chile a couple of times, and it still marvels me, and it makes me think. But I think it really brings in that human element of how we feel about things like art and music and poetry, because a lot of it doesn't always necessarily make sense, but it makes us feel and act and respond to things in an incredibly different way. And I think wine sits in that beautiful spot between science and art, and that magic and that mystery, and the bit that doesn't make sense and is hard to articulate is such a huge part of wine for me. And yeah, there are definitely a few moments. I mean, I spent 5 days in Tasmania 13 years ago, almost exactly 13 years ago. And now I live here. And that 5 days, I was like, okay, I'm home. Right. Interesting. Which was not the plan. So yeah, there is that very emotive side that is hugely important.
But I think that's very nice what you're saying, that you came there and 13 years ago, and after 5 days you're like, yeah, I'm home. And also what you said about this being a bit, well, it's a bit floating, I guess, because terroir is very, very personal for everyone. And having a sense of terroir in a wine, you can try to explain it to someone, but I think that everyone will explain it differently. Even there's just no correct or incorrect way of explaining these things. What about you, Rastislav? Do you have a favorite terroir, or a terroir that speaks to you like it spoke to Curly?
I think, yes, I agree. I think that also terroir is about the progress, because in Slovakia we have modern era of Slovakian wines almost 30 years, because before 1989 it then became free after the revolution in the Czech Republic and Hungary and countries in East Europe. Everything changed, because until 1989 all people owned everything, but no one anything. And now we started looking at the best places. We have 700 registered wine plots, and still about the progress. And for me, it's also about terroir to people. Now became the wine in Slovakia very famous, and we started to organize the wine festivals, wine celebration in the vineyards, in the center of the vineyards, and you can see the people chatting, drinking in between the rows of the wines. Is very, very funny to see and to listen how wine can change culture, how wine can change the gastronomy, everything, because it doesn't exist until 1989 here in Slovakia, for example, in Czech Republic, and this is very fascinating to me. Maybe I made the people somewhere open my mind to discover me how to understand this place, how to understand other place, and I respect the people when open my mind and something new to bring me.
So basically, you were part of the birth of a new terroir.
Yes.
That's interesting, because I mean, everyone else here comes from, well, maybe Matt, how long have you been having wine in, when did you start making wine in California? Oh, in Canada?
I wish.
Yeah.
Me personally, or are you talking about Canadians in general?
No, Canadians in general.
I mean, it's maybe a 40-year-old industry, I would say.
Exactly.
Serious,
So
getting into, vitis vinifera, I would say. Yeah, it's interesting. I think speaking about like Brian's point about how the geographic landscape affects culture and people is, I mean, outside of a wine context, I come from the suburbs outside Toronto, which I mean is pretty much just a strip mall. So I mean, growing up, there's no culture of being outdoors and hiking and doing all that stuff. And then I moved to Vancouver, and I mean, just a city where it's just nature is just shoved in your face. There's mountains and there's ocean, and I hiked last weekend, and at the top of the mountain there's 200 people. The only time 200 people get together in Southern Ontario is probably at like an Olive Garden. So I mean, I think the idea that our natural landscape really influences the culture around it, it makes sense. And even though, I mean, I didn't grow up with immersed in wine the way that someone might if they grew up in Burgundy or Barolo, but I can totally understand that you just walk and it's just in the air, the idea of wine and the idea of terroir.
Yeah, it is special to everyone, I think, in different ways, depending on where you've been, where you've traveled, or where you live or come from. But because traditionally old world wines, they were defined by the typicity of place and the regional regulations that went with that. But the new world wines were more defined by typicity of a grape variety. Marcelo, how do you feel about the fact that so many people define the terroir of Argentina by the that's the most difficult word I know, characteristics of Malbec, obviously?
Yes, Laura, I think that is a fact. It's the variety plays a huge role in terroir expression. If you don't choose the right variety, you cannot express that terroir in all its potential of that terroir. So because the variety should match the local climatic condition of that area, of that terroir. If that variety arrives too early or too late for that climate, will not reflect all the potential, the quality potential of that terroir. So Malbec, of course, that match very well the climatic variation in the Los Andes foothills. But there are other varieties as well that are showing huge potential for expressing our terroir, like I know Cabernet Franc, for example. There are some beautiful Chardonnay as well, some Pinot Noirs in Patagonia. But of course, that Malbec is our main variety, planted in most of our terroir in Argentina. So you can make some comparison between terroirs.
Okay, yeah, absolutely.
Can I say something? I was just going to add that I think that
absolutely
this idea that one grape variety is a vector for terroir is quite new in a way. I mean, not so much in Burgundy, although historically, there were mixed plantings of things, but certainly in the more traditional bits, we might call them of the old world, like Argentina and Chile and the United States and bits of South Africa, but also in the old world, people planted field blends. They didn't plant one grape and think which is the key in the door that will express this place. They thought, let's look at a basket of grapes and let the place express the grapes rather than the grape express the place, if that makes sense, does it?
Yeah, a bit like Portugal.
Yeah, Portugal is the same.
Yeah. But what about Australia, Curly? Because in Australia, it's also been a lot of focus on like Cab, Shiraz, and those Chardonnay or those varietals.
Yeah, it's very interesting being down in Tasmania rather than Australia Major, because that idea of typicity of what a grape should taste like is so prevalent in both industry and consumers. So, I spend most of my time sort of customer facing. And so particularly when I do wine tours, Chardonnay is a big one. there's always this idea I don't like Chardonnay, I don't drink Chardonnay, and then having to explain why it's different down in Tasmania, and just that idea of, oh, you couldn't do a decent Shiraz, you can't get a decent red out of Tasmania. And it's not a quality issue, it's an understanding of what something should or shouldn't be. And because our wines don't come back big and bold and fruity and jammy, to some people, they're not correct anymore. They've ceased to be anything of a decent wine. And that's a really interesting concept to work with, is understanding that people really know varieties, they know the grape variety, but they don't know much more. And I think a part of that as well is access to wines from other places. You know, we are so far from other major grape growing locations because New Zealand's quite little. You know, it's awesome, but you know, it's a smaller location. You have to really go very far. So the accessibility of wines of other flavors are quite alien to a lot of people here, and I think that really does shape that idea of typicity and terroir compared to a grape variety in itself.
Yeah, and I guess, I mean, Chardonnay is the perfect example. I mean, what other grape just drinks up terroir? Like, I mean, how many times haven't you heard, I don't like Chardonnay, and then you go like, but it's a Chablis. Oh, I love Chablis, but I don't like Chardonnay. So
yeah, and you know, and I think it's important as well to guide people through that.
Obviously,
because
yeah.
You know, because you know, it's so easy to kind of go, how did you not know? But there's no benefit from that. It should be the beginning of a joyous discovery.
Exactly. And I totally think that that's very important when trying to convey this message to consumers, because I mean, the concept of terroir is difficult enough for us people who work in the industry. But what about the guests and the consumers? How do you recognize a terroir-driven wine? Is it important to communicate that to your guests? And if so, how? How do you do that? Rostislav, how would you communicate that to your guests in a restaurant?
Some of the guests would say me, I don't like too much French wines because are a little bit complicated. I still was modest to them and explain them what does it mean. Terroir is not very simple because terroir is still in progress and made more than 1,000 years. But I like the music. I love the music, and it reminds me something like orchestra. And when it is playing London Symphony or Berlin Symphony or Vienna Philharmonic, and they play the same symphonic, fantastic for Berlioz. The concept is still different. They have different strings. They have different horns. The conductor is different, but they play the same music from the same notes, but it's still different, and still can be very unique and original. And to my mind, this terroir definition in terms of diversity, originality, and everything is something like the orchestra when it's playing some art, and in different way, but still very nice, very, very graceful. Maybe something like that. I don't know.
I like the notion of comparing things, because as soon as you have like a hook to put something on, like memory trigger, that's always a great thing to compare it with. Matt, what do you think? How would you convey it to your guests or your students?
Well,
you educate?
I mean, well, I should be careful. As a French programs director, I don't want to impugn the notion of terroir. I could be out of a job in about an hour. I mean, as a sommelier personally, I wouldn't get into that conversation on a Friday night to a table, just because it is so multifaceted. And also, I mean, you know, I think George Orwell said, you know, never use a foreign phrase or a scientific word when a normal English equivalent will do. And so, I mean, I might talk about a wine, the environment it came from, but generally, I mean, for a guest, if my number one goal with a guest is finding the most appropriate wine for them in that occasion. And so to me, talking about typicity is a much more important conversation to have with a guest. You know, if they say they like something rich or something light, you know, having a guest to understand the typicity of wines around the world, why wines from Burgundy might taste the way they do versus the wines of, say, the Russian River Valley. That's as much including the decisions that go into winemaking, historical, cultural, the use of oak, what type of oak. It's using the decisions of human beings, which I think, which I've already disagreed with Tim on. I think that's actually a separate issue than the physical terroir that a wine comes from. And so I think if your typicity is the best way, understanding typicity is the best way to make an educated guess about whether or not this bottle of wine is going to be appropriate for you right now. And I think that's the issue I try to steer towards with guests.
Yeah, I guess that conversation is more for a slow Tuesday night.
Yeah.
A very slow Tuesday night.
Exactly. We can go on forever, that discussion. What about you, Curly?
Oh, look, I think, I get the luxury of sometimes being in a vineyard or in a place rather than in a building when I'm talking about wine with people. And so sometimes it is just talking about, hey, you know how it's warmer from where we parked the van to where you're stood right now? That makes a difference. You took your jacket off, and just to put things into a very real sense. But I love Ratislav's idea of music, because Rodriguez and Slash have got very different approaches to a guitar. And, I think that's why I found myself saying it depends so much, is it's that little way of showing there are so many options out there. And it depends partly on where you are, and, like Matt was saying about the culture, and there's so many things, and also what that grape will do, what you could do, and all of those things together. And that's why it can be complicated, but also where we sit to guide people through and help them with those questions of, yeah, but why though? But, just to be approachable and open and use very real world examples, I think is probably the most important thing.
Yeah, and that is true. And I wanted to ask Jean-Pierre this question too, because I know that, Jean-Pierre, you've been doing this for a long time, and you've been to, I don't know how many fairs where there are not necessarily regular consumers, but wine trade people. Do you have to explain the concept of terroir to them sometimes? And how would you do that? How do you approach professionals who maybe are importers of wine and don't know that much about wine?
First, for sure, we've been developing a lot of educational tools in order to welcome guests, and not only professional, also final consumers in our different wineries. And I've been around the world with a lot of soil and subsoil samples that was showcasing, which was strictly forbidden, and you shouldn't be caught by a custom officer with heavy loads of stones coming from your region. But at least it was a very good way for consumers, but also for the trade. And we did that experiment again in Châteauneuf-du-Pape with Ogier, where people could taste coming from different soil, subsoil, same type, Grenache, 60 years old, vinified the same way, aged the same way, bottled the same week. So the only main difference was about soil and subsoil, which is part of the terroir effect. And so this started to give a lot of instruction to everybody and could be given to the whole trade to consumer thing. So definitely educational tools, we develop the same for everybody, because we consider everybody can have this feeling, understanding, and emotion, no matter where you are a consumer or if you are a trade guy.
I agree. And I've been very lucky. I've tried that special tasting as well. And it is really amazing to see how one grape variety from grown in different terroir just tastes so different. We are going to move on a little bit. We're going to go on to more the technical aspects of vineyard health and climate change, because we're talking about organic, biodynamics, regenerative viticulture. There's been a lot of attention over the last few decades on different approaches to healthy vineyards in the pursuit of more authentic expressions in the wines. Yet the very nature of changing the way the vineyard is farmed, and the climate change happening around us means that the established terroir may be traditional and perhaps even authentic, but not necessarily healthy and sustainable. So hopefully this is something that you all have ideas on. So discuss anything that, Tim, I'm sure you have lots of things you want to say about this.
Well, I mean, about climate change, I think climate change is extremely scary. And I think that particularly in areas which are are marginal, semi-marginal, where a cool climate is part of the identity of the wine style, and there are lots of those, not just Burgundy, obviously, but also presumably applied to Tasmania and parts of New Zealand. I think things are gonna change, and I don't think the wine industry is thinking ahead enough. I mean, I was in Montagny a couple of years ago, tasting a range of very boring Chardonnays. And Chardonnay really suffers from climate change, much more, I would say, than Pinot Noir. And I said to the people there, have you thought about planting something else? And they looked at me as if I just insulted them. And they said, well, like what? And I said, well, have you thought about planting Marsanne or Grenache Blanc or, I don't know, Assyrtiko or Albarino, anything with acidity, Chenin Blanc? And they looked at me and thought I was crazy. But I think that they're almost the conversations we, or rather wine makers and the wine business, need to be having. I think that this challenge we're facing is not going away. I think it's going to get worse. It may never get better, who knows? But I think that the world of wine as we know it is going to be thrown up in the air and transformed, for the better in some places, but for the worse in others over the next 50 years.
It is very interesting what you're saying there, Tim, because you say that they looked at you like you've insulted them. But what about the aspect of the wine laws? I mean, it took forever to get these laws really written down and accepted. And now if they're even going to start thinking ahead, that's where they should probably start as well, because if they're going to wait for 30 years every time they want to make a new appellation or a new change in an appellation, that's going to take forever too.
It is. I mean, it's happening slowly. But remember that the people who make the wine laws in the end are the producers. You know, they set up the syndicat, and they're the people who have the big influence. And it might be cooperatives in some places, but they definitely can influence legislation. I mean, I think a bigger worrying is something that if it turns, for example, Burgundy on its head, that the Grand Cru vineyards, which are always the vineyards that got ripe in the coldest vintages, are now getting overripe. In 2 vintages out of 3, and really egregiously overripe in very hot vintages. What does that do to the price of fine wine and to people's perception of it? If suddenly a vineyard in the Haute Côte is actually consistently making more balanced wines than Clos de Bez, then that throws thousands of years of wine experience and knowledge up in the air, really. And I don't have an answer to what's going to happen.
That's a great point.
Also, so I was just going to respond. It's interesting what that will do to the appellation system, the idea of the appellation system. I mean, the idea of the appellation system, well, one of the ideas is that a consumer can go pick up a bottle and they know what they're getting, you know, and I mean, if 100 years from now, it's entirely different grapes planted in Burgundy because of climate change, I mean, what is the point of having the appellation system anymore? You know, it's totally, I actually feel like the new world is going to be far more adaptable to that, just because they're not as hindered by their by appellations.
But what about talking about the new world? Marcelo, obviously in Argentina, they've been growing grapes higher and higher again. I mean, they keep making new vineyards at higher altitudes. Is that still going on? Are you going even higher now because of climate change?
Yes, of course. We need to change in order to adapt to global warming, of course. And for me, working with very or clustered temperature has been one of my professional obsession in the last 20 years, you know. So one of them is site selection, as you said, Leora, looking for places with, you know, higher altitude. Looking for close valleys. That mean those valleys that has 2 mountain range in the east side and the west side in order to reduce the number of radiation hours per day. Also going close to the ocean. We have explored Chapadmalal very close to the Atlantic Ocean in order to get, you know, all the freshness of the sea, and also taking advantage of the windy condition, of course, that reduce fruit temperature as well. So and always trying to find new vineyard management technique, like changing row orientation, not planting north-south row orientation has been one of our work for many years. Planting east-west or 45 degrees northwest southeast, changing the canopy management, the vine balance approach as well, and using, you know, vineyard netting for hail here. also help you to decrease the cluster temperature in the fruit zone. So there are many things like cover crops that can reduce the soil temperature as well. So we are using many variables to approach the global warming in our vineyards.
And what about, sorry, yeah, Curly, please.
No, I was just going to jump in that Wine Tasmania have actually started Vin Zero, and that's a program that's looking at biodiversity. I've just pulled it up here. Soil health, managing pests and disease in an environmentally responsible manner, measuring, managing, reducing, mitigating carbon emissions, aim for carbon neutral, biosecurity they're looking at. So managing waste, recycling, measuring and minimizing water use. So, you know, there's definitely, I think we need to be professionally nimble as an industry.
Very true.
And I think we can do that without losing the personality of the different places, because I think if we are adapting to where we are sort of climatically, the challenges that we've got, we're all still going to change slightly differently. And I think it really does depend on whether we are actually working, protecting and looking after our environment, or whether people are dogmatically looking at one way of producing grapes, producing wine, selling wine, serving wine, all of those things. If we can't be professionally nimble, which is ridiculous, we should be a fairly intellectually, you know, savvy bunch. You know, technically we're all quite bright. So, you know, it's possible, but it just depends on whether we, I think as a whole industry, want to be that nimble.
Yeah, I think what you said, it's confronting or questioning received wisdom, this idea of being professionally nimble. I mean, again, it's an act of faith almost, that ploughing, particularly with horses, is a good thing in certain vineyards. And yet, you know, there is evidence to suggest that ploughing is actually not a good thing, particularly in soils where there's not a lot of moisture in the soils. So again, I think, you know, it's not taking all these things as on trust, really, just because they've always been done in the past. I like your idea of being professionally nimble very much. I think that's a good point.
But I was just going to ask you, Jean-Pierre, because Bordeaux, it's flat. You can't go higher. So what are these things that Curly has been talking about? What would Bordeaux do? Yeah.
So we are numerous in Bordeaux, so I will tell you what we do, and you will ask other people in Bordeaux. But we have two ways of looking at that problem, because it's a real problem. The first, we bet on the fact that the quality level of certain territories are going to be higher in the coming years. And we have invested massively in the northern part of Médoc, because today, northern part of Médoc, thanks to the Atlantic influence, is really a cool climate, and you can grow there Cabernet Sauvignon much more nicely than in the southern part of Médoc, where the wines start to be at 14 alcohol, 15% alcohol. So this is one way of looking at it. But Tim, you are right. Even if the French, we are working under the loyaux et constants usage, we are more and more aware that we have to move ourselves to a new kind of agriculture. And Marcello, we also do a lot of tests. Organic farming, biodynamic farming is one thing, but we are now implementing permaculture in different vineyards just to check if we can go out of this work of soil that has been described as the top thing for many years, but now is described as potentially dangerous for water evaporation. So we are implementing different things to learn from our own mistakes and to make sure we can adapt to those new conditions.
But it's interesting what Matt was saying then earlier, that what about the appellation system then? If we're all going to go to the north of Médoc, what happens to Saint-Estèphe, Pauillac, all these first growth, etc.?
Yeah, so they would implement new type of viticulture to adapt themselves, because we cannot go higher. We cannot move Margaux as an AOC, but the way we produce those wines, Tim is correct. We are just among us. So the organisme de défense and de gestion, it's just us. So we just have to make sure that we realize what is going to happen and to make sure that we don't sink with the boat.
Yeah, exactly. Is there any problems in Slovakia? I'm seeing that Slovakia is quite a young wine country. Have you adapted already along the way, or?
Yeah, yes, and like Jean-Pierre said, in Slovakia is also, you can go to 3,000 meters above sea level, like in Salta and Mendoza. Also, we don't have ocean influence. We don't have Carignan and some the grapes that can resist the heat. In continental climate here in central Europe, Slovakia, Hungary, Austria is changing a lot. But I noticed that winemakers or wine growers who perfectly learned or more and more know their vineyards, their wine garden, the more and more the subtle this terroir, this vineyard needs. Also in the term of the organic, also term of the maybe ecological approach. And in 1999 was the first registered bio-vineyards in Slovakia, and I remember the first 6 vintages from this vineyard was something special. The wine was still a little bit fleshy and a little bit supple. But now, after 20 years, the rhythm of the vineyard dramatically changed. And there is still the same variety, still the exposure, still the same elevation, but the vineyards start to living itself. And now the wines has no 13.5 alcohol like before, but instead of it has a 12.5 alcohol. Nice, very good tension. The wine has a nice crispy acidity and purity. And it all changed. The winemaker was the wine grower was the ecological approach, and because he learned 10 years how this vineyard works, how he's living the vineyard. It's my point of view is very important to learn to find the best way how to understand the terroir, understand the nature.
Thank you. If we start to look ahead, what do you see as the biggest threat to the concept of terroir and terroir-driven wines? Open question for everyone.
I think it is not. I think it is not listening to the experts, what's going on, and also not pulling from other industries doing really interesting and positive work. I do a lot of work with wider agriculture and farmers here, mainly within food production, but also I'm slightly obsessed with James Rebanks. I don't know if the rest of you are familiar with him. I'll send a link, but he's done some really interesting work on rewilding, adding that, biodiversity. We've actually got a wine producer up here, Swinging Gate. Doug's an old horticulturist, so he's come from a broader fruit agricultural side, and he's at the point now where he's just like, well, we bought this vineyard, it wasn't in great health, and now that it's getting back to where we want it to be, we don't feed the vines, we feed the soil, we feed the microbes. That's what we do. And so I think as well, it's looking at pulling from other agricultural industries who've had some really good successes to make sure that we're really looking after and understanding the land that we've got, because we're going to move, it's going to change, we can't get around that. And I think the really smart regions and the successes are going to be about the ones who tackle it head on, think of the future and not just, the next paycheck, the next vintage release. I think that's where the real success is, where we're going to see people thriving.
Don't you think also this idea, which is related to what you're saying, of avoiding a monoculture, in that, you look
absolutely.
at Rioja, Rioja Oriental, nearly everybody's planting the same high-producing Tempranillo clone, and to me, that's not terroir. That's just production. It's kilos of grapes, and I think your point about biodiversity and diversity of species and of having areas within vineyards which are not just planted with vines, which are are natural sort of biospheres, really, is all part of how we deal with this, but also of good viticulture, really.
And also, I think one thing that we, from I'm going to do as political as I like here, is looking at the indigenous people of all of the regions where we are. And, these are people who, you know, as a culture, it's about being a custodian of the land. It's not about the now. And it's knowledge and wisdom that we have largely, from a Eurocentric point of view, skipped over.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, it's, if there was ever a time to start listening and shut up for a bit, this is probably it.
Yeah. Yeah.
You're probably
I
right.
agree
But
that-
what about Canada, Matt? Because in Canada, it's fairly cool. And the cool climate, it's obviously changing towards warmer climate. Does that help the industry in Canada more than it at the moment?
I mean, what they used to call it in France, the good problem. At least people just stop drinking ice wine, I suppose, and think of our dry wines. No one here drinks it. It's just sold to you guys. No, I mean, it's a huge problem in the Okanagan. Forest fires are a near constant. I moved to Vancouver in 2015, and I would say at least 3 vintages have been, you know, catastrophic. It looks like the moon sort of weeks, and we've noticed that in our wines. So it's definitely a big problem for sure. I'm not sure if it's Ontario. Our 2 main wine regions, Ontario and the Okanagan, are very different, but it's not a great time to be anywhere, I suppose. I think we should learn, you know, as much as we're talking about terroir, hopefully these moves towards regenerative farming and biodiversity, these are actually the goal is much larger than just making nice wine. The goal is not to destroy the planet and not to poison, you know, farm workers. So hopefully, I mean, there are places in the world in 50 years where maybe it's not morally responsible to be making wine anymore. Just because there's just no, I mean, you need water for people to survive. So I think we need to come to terms with that as well.
Well, interesting that you say that there's not enough water. We've had a question come in from Kjetil Krongard Sauer. I'm quite sure that he is located in Denmark. Hi, Kjetil. Great that you're asking some questions. And his question is, some regions don't use irrigation. Do you think this will change in the future?
Who wants to answer it?
Perhaps the agronomist?
Yeah, I think Marcelo should
What do you think, Marcelo?
Here in Argentina,
hospital pass, as we say in English.
Yeah, here in Argentina, mostly is irrigated. We have irrigated vineyard. We have just one exception in Chapalmalal, that we have a dry farm vineyard. It was a challenge for us as a viticulture, because we are dealing with water and with irrigation. I think that irrigation sometimes can make a more uniform soil that could be sometimes against a terroir expression. But the irrigation design, according to soil variation in the same vineyard, is a key in order to keep the terroir expression in the fruit in the vineyard. So the irrigation design is very, very important, and as well the right monitoring of the irrigation system, and how do you define how many millimeter a day you have to irrigate. Don't to over irrigate or to under irrigate. You need always the vine under some kind of water stress in order to produce the best quality potential of the site. I don't have the experience in Europe. I know that some areas are introducing irrigation, but I agree with Tim that we need to be careful regarding the productivity of the vineyard, because when you start pushing yield and having more yield, you start losing identity and sense of place, and I agree with that. So you need to be very careful not that irrigation, you know, push too much the yield to overcome the sense expression of the fruit.
I wonder if what we're going to see a little bit of is a move towards so-called Mediterranean grapes. I mean, the Mediterranean grapes could actually include something like Chenin Blanc in a way, because these are grape varieties that retain acidity in hot climates, even without irrigation. And I know I always think in Argentina, why doesn't Argentina plant more Grenache, or Carignan or Sanso? These are all Mediterranean grapes that have shown, or grape varieties with high acidity like like Petit Verdot, naturally high in acidity. And I wonder whether in the warmer bits of the world, we're going to see that shift in the grape varieties or the grape mix in the vineyards. I don't know, but it would make sense.
I agree with that. Yes, all the southern Rhone varieties has a huge potential in this context of warmer climate. And Rosanne, Marsanne, Grenache, yeah. we have some beautiful experience here in Argentina. And I agree with that thing.
Yeah, Mourvèdre, Mataro, obviously, all of those sorts of grapes.
There's probably going to be a change in grape varieties many places in the world, I'm guessing. We got a question here for Jean-Pierre. I don't know who sent in the question, but the person wrote, you mentioned that there are tests with organic and biodynamic production in Bordeaux. How are the tests looking, and do you think this is the future for Bordeaux?
Well, it's not the future. Things are not that easy. It would be so easy for all of us to have only one answer. But for sure, to be closer to the grapes, to be closer to the soil. Many years ago, we were not really looking what was happening underneath the ground. And Professor Bourguignon and Lydia, they went pushing us. Be careful, guys. You need to have livestock inside the soil. And for many years, we didn't pay attention to that. Now we are also looking at the ecosystem around us. And so pretty sure that if we combine all of this with precise viticulture, with making sure that we are not using clone anymore, but more massal selection, introducing different individuals, because you can imagine after the pandemic, behind me, you see vineyards planted at 10,000 feet by hectare. If you have one disease coming here, it goes all the way. So how we stop that? So all this is at the moment at a trial in our organization, and we are making sure that in the future we will be able to implement in different areas. Like Chateau Patache d'Eau is a very large estate. It's not possible to convert it organic or biodynamic from one day to another. You need to go step by step and not being dogmatic, because in the past we have been dogmatic for many years with the French, so we have to be more careful now. And so by introducing all these elements, all these ingredients, and by studying the impact really scientifically, we can change the viticulture of tomorrow. And this is what we are trying to experience. But there is not one path. There will be many, many different paths because the conditions are different everywhere. And I can tell you that in between Saint-Emilion and the north of Médoc, it's such a huge difference in everything that solution will be different in those places.
It's very interesting you mentioned the Bourguignons, Claude and Lydia, because I think a part of their philosophy is about microbial terroir, that it's about the bacteria and the fungi in the soil. It's
exactly.
not the bedrock or the soil. It's the whole environment. And I think that's something that we don't really understand. Right?
And now it's also about all the life which is around and in the earth. I mean, the birds, the bats, and all these that are our first help in order to destroy all the nuisibles that can be damaging the vineyards. And so how these are going to help us to stop some of the product that we are using, how this is going to balance better the grapes, and maybe no need for using water, because we have water. It's not coming at the right time, but we have water. So if our soils, if our
you can have some of ours. We've got loads. It's been raining for a month.
If our clay is clean and healthy enough to keep the water for next month, this is the thing we have to give to our terroir.
Well said. Well, we are going to end off much where we started. We're going to ask each one of you to look back through your lexicon of terroirs that you've tasted over time. And I'd love for you to name a wine or the wine or terroir that helped you best understand the concept of terroir. And while we're doing this, we'd love for all of you who are watching to do the same. Please leave it in the comment section on Facebook. What was your first terroir wine, the wine that made you understand more about terroir? Rostislav, what was your terroir wine?
The best or ideal terroir for the wine is not the same like the wine from the best terroir. And in my mind, the best lexicon wine or essential wine to my mind is Tokay. Hungarian Tokaj and a Slovak Tokaj. This is the unique spot when you have something different than anywhere in the world. You have the mold, a covered wall in the cellar, which also protect the wine on the barrel with the floor. You have the typicity grape varieties. You have the style. You have something unique inside, and this is, to my mind, something what is still I'm not discovered for if I were living to life. And the wines, of course, of them are very, very variable. You can have dry white ones from the Tokaj. You can have semi-dried. You can have very, very sweet wines, but all of them are very gastronomic friendly, which is to my mind, like sommelier, very important. Tokaj is something what I didn't discover anywhere in the world.
So Tokaj would be your go-to terroir-driven region where you understood more about terroir for the first time. Cool. Marcelo, is it an Argentine wine or is it something else?
Okay, that's difficult because every terroir that I have managed or planted the vineyard has taught me something in
but
my
before that,
so,
before you started working the vineyards yourself, when you started understanding or liking wine, when was it that you first thought about the notion of terroir in a wine?
I think that when I came back to Argentina in 2000, before being in US, studying there, working with Daniel B and starting the first project of the terroir series in Trapiche was a big understanding of the impact of terroir in wine. So probably in my early viticulture professional life was for me changed my approach in viticulture for sure.
Nice. Matt, was it a hybrid?
No, I grew up drinking Coca-Cola with dinner. So there was no grand origin story.
No, I haven't tasted a lot of hybrids. I would love to try to find terroir in a hybrid.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm not to brag, I'm actually somewhat too young to remember when it was mostly hybrids in my my area. I mean, for me, I think one of the most, it didn't happen right at the beginning, but I got to visit Argentina a few years ago, and there the focus really is on elevation, which I find really interesting because it's focusing on one specific element that I can kind of pin down about terroir, and seeing how 200-meter gain changes the concept, changes what Cabernet or Malbec does in the glass. And I mean, one of my frustrations with terroir and terroir-driven wines is that it's such a nebulous term that means so many things to so many different people that it can almost mean nothing. It can be hard to it can be too philosophical. And so getting a chance to really dive deep into a very specific element and seeing how one thing changes everything is it appealed to my organized mind. So I mean, the wines of Colomé especially, I think, were really eye-opening for me.
Cool. I haven't been there yet. I'd love to go to Salta and taste the terroir up there, very high up. How about you, Curly?
Oh, look, even though I am an absolute sparkling tragic, sherry was probably my big terroir moment because I could not get my head around it. For years, I struggled constantly. But then I managed to go when I was doing my diploma with González Baez to Jerez. And I completely understood why I don't really do Fino and that I love dry Oloroso. And it was, I suppose it's all of those elements of the sense of place and the variety and the soils and the sunshine and the architecture and the, it's the everything that made me finally go, right, okay, totally makes sense. I get this now. Because it was such a stumbling block for me before. And then it was just, right, yeah, I'm in, I understand. Please don't.
Isn't that lovely when the coin just drops and you go like, now I get it.
Yeah. And so I can just say, no, please don't give me Fino. Dry Oloroso, keep it coming.
And Tim.
Oh, I mean, so many different wines. But I suppose in the end, what you want is something which could only come from that place. And I take Curly's point about sherry, but I think sherry is as much a process as it is about terroir. I mean, we can argue about the broader definition. I'd probably go with something like an Assyrtiko from Santorini, because I think if you were tasting that blind, or I were tasting that blind, I'd like to think in a just with some friends tasting it blind, I would know what that was. Thank God I don't have to do the EMW exam ever again. But in the EMW exam, you'd think I should know what this is. So I think I'd go with something like that. If somewhere else were paying, I'd probably go with something like a Mizuni. But I'm sadly I can't afford to drink those wines anymore myself. But I think Burgundy, or something from the Mosel, maybe. A Valen Zonana from Prum or something. That's pretty terroir driven, I think.
I agree. Jean-Pierre.
Well, my first stroke with terroir was at Domaine La Roche as a student, nice. Way before I knew that I would work for La Roche one day. And we were tasting Grand Cru and Premier Cru within the cellar where monks used to make wine 1,000 years ago. Yeah. And during all that period, for 1,000 years, you imagine all vintages in the same cellar, the same wines. For me, that was just unbelievable. After visiting the vineyards, to be there and to have behind us and almost in the glass 1,000 years of experience, it was really something.
And 1,000 years ago, they were saying, I can't believe we've had a frost again.
This has been a great webinar, guys. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us and offer your experiences, insights. Curly sent a link here on the chat in Zoom. We'll share it on the Facebook group. But next month, we're going to expand our horizons because there's more to life, food and drinks than just grapes. With more and more consumers enjoying non-alcoholic beverages and the rise of sake, spirits, and beer sommeliers, we're not only rethinking beverages, but also what we serve with them. So for our July webinar, we ask our sommeliers how they are incorporating the alternative beverages in the classical pairings. And our guests will include Argentina-born French-based Paz Levinson, whom I'm sure many of you know already, Sweden's very hip Carl Sjöström, as he pushes the boundaries of what we call wine, the magic of water with water sommelier Ciro Fontanesi, who will be representing our gold partner San Pellegrino and Acquapanna, Christopher Ward from the UK representing ASI partner and glass manufacturer Chef and Sommelier, and Christian Peske from Estonia, beer somm, as well as a wine somm. And we are still waiting for confirmation from our Japanese participant, but I am pretty sure it's going to be a somm who many of you might know. His name is, it's a bit difficult for me to pronounce, Atsuhide Hoshiyama. So hopefully we'll be welcoming them all next month. We'll all be talking about the influence of not only the beverage, but the glass itself when it comes to our glass manufacturer, obviously. Be sure to keep an eye on our social media channels as well. We'll be talking throughout the month about different pairings, asking you for input on new favorites, old classics, and what exists beyond the grape. So join us July 19th. It's a Monday again at 3 p.m. CET. And thanks everyone today. It's been a great discussion. Lovely to have you with us. And see everyone in about a month's time.
See everyone.
Ciao.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Yeah.